The crystal chandeliers of the Meridian cast fractured light across white tablecloths as the final patrons of Tuesday evening lingered over cognac and hushed conversations. Charleston's elite treated this restaurant like a second home, a place where business deals dissolved into handshakes and secrets, exchanged hands beneath linen napkins. She moved between tables with the kind of invisibility that came from years of being looked through rather than at, her movements precise and economical. The black uniform hung slightly loose on her frame, the apron tied with a double knot that had become muscle memory. Her name tag read simply, Claire, though the manager still called her the new girl, despite 18 months of service. The kitchen had already begun its closing rituals, the clatter of pans muted by thick walls and generations of discretion. She refilled water glasses that were still half full, a routine that kept her hands busy and her presence forgettable. The corner booth had been occupied for 3 hours by a man whose presence seemed to bend the air around him. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. The documents spread before him remained untouched for the last 40 minutes, while his phone stayed dark and silent. She had learned to read danger the way some people read weather, a skill inherited from a childhood spent measuring her father's footsteps on the stairs. This man radiated control, the kind that didn't need to announce itself with volume or movement. When she'd poured his wine an hour ago, his thank you had been so soft she'd almost missed it entirely. His eyes had met hers for exactly 1 second. Before returning to papers he wasn't actually reading. Something about that brief connection had felt like recognition, though they'd never met before. The entrance door opened without its usual chime, the electronic bell mysteriously silent, as 5 men entered wearing suits that didn't quite fit the restaurant's atmosphere. Their shoes were wrong for the polished marble, their watches too flashy for old Charleston money. The maitre d' moved to intercept them, but the lead man simply walked past as if protocol didn't apply to his world. They didn't wait to be seated, instead positioning themselves with military precision throughout the dining room like chess pieces claiming squares. 2 flanked the entrance to the private dining area. 1 stood near the kitchen doors. Another positioned himself by the bar while the 5th man remained by the host stand. He was broad-shouldered with a scar running from his left ear to his collar, his hands clasped in front of him. The remaining patrons sensed the shift immediately, conversations faltering mid-sentence as instinct registered what conscious minds hadn't yet processed. An elderly couple at table 12 quietly requested their check. The businessman who'd been working on his laptop began packing up with deliberate casualness. Within minutes, the exodus began with the kind of smooth efficiency that came from money, knowing when to exit stage left. Claire watched from the service station as the room emptied, her hands continuing to polish wine glasses that didn't need polishing. The manager disappeared into his office without explanation, the door clicking shut with unusual finality. The sommelier found sudden urgent business in the wine cellar. Even the busboy who usually lingered for overtime vanished into the night. She stood alone in the dining room now, except for the man in the corner booth and the 5 who'd come for him. The air felt thick, compressed, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the wine glass. The man at the corner booth hadn't moved, his posture unchanged, as if he hadn't registered the invasion of his space. But Claire saw the subtle shift in his jaw, the way his right hand had dropped below the table's edge. He knew exactly what was happening. She picked up a wine bottle from the service station, a 2015 Bordeaux that cost $400. Her feet carried her toward the corner booth, while her mind screamed at her to run. Every survival instinct she'd ever developed told her to be anywhere but here. But she'd seen something in the scar-faced man's jacket when he'd turned, a flash of copper wire and a small black box. Her ex-boyfriend had shown her the same setup once, bragging about his crew's technical capabilities. A remote detonator waiting for someone to stand up, to shift their weight, to trigger the pressure-sensitive device beneath the seat. She reached the corner booth and lifted the wine bottle, her hand perfectly steady now. The man looked up at her with those dark eyes, a question forming in his expression. She leaned forward to pour, her body angling to block the view from the 5 men watching. Her lips barely moved as she whispered the words that would either save his life or end hers. "If you stand up, you die first." The wine poured in a steady stream, the sound covering her voice. She didn't look at him, didn't let her expression change from professional courtesy. His entire body went rigid, but he didn't move otherwise, understanding flooding his features. She saw his eyes flick downward, calculating, then back to her face. The wine glass filled to exactly the proper level, and she straightened, turning away with the bottle. Her legs felt like water as she walked to the next table, an empty foretop that didn't need service. She set down fresh napkins with hands that only trembled when no one was watching. The scar-faced man's eyes tracked her movement, but found nothing suspicious in a waitress doing her job. The man in the corner booth remained frozen, his breathing shallow and controlled. He understood pressure triggers, understood that the slightest shift in weight could complete a circuit. His mind was probably racing through scenarios, calculating odds, mapping the room for cover that didn't exist. She moved to table 8 and began clearing dessert plates that had been abandoned in the exodus. The sound of porcelain clinking filled the terrible silence, ordinary noise in an extraordinary moment. Her peripheral vision caught one of the 5 men checking his watch with growing impatience. They'd expected him to stand by now, to react to their presence with either confrontation or retreat. Instead, he sat perfectly still, a statue carved from expensive suit and calculated composure. The trap required movement to spring, and he'd given them nothing. The man by the kitchen doors shifted his weight, his hand moving to his ear. He was wearing a comm device, receiving instructions from somewhere outside. Claire recognized the gesture from her ex's crew, the way they'd coordinate during jobs she'd pretended not to notice. She carried her tray of dishes toward the kitchen, passing close enough to the bar to hear the man stationed there breathing heavily. These weren't professionals used to waiting, to patience. They were muscle-hired for a specific job that should have been finished 5 minutes ago. The kitchen doors swung open under her shoulder, and she set the tray down with exaggerated care. Through the circular window she could see the corner booth, see him sitting with preternatural stillness. His wine remained untouched, his hands now both visible on the table. The chef had left through the back exit, the ovens cooling in neat rows. She was truly alone now with 6 men, and a bomb that needed a trigger. Her phone sat in her locker upstairs. Useless. The landline in the manager's office might as well have been on the moon. She pushed back through the doors carrying nothing, just a waitress checking on her final table. The scar-faced man's eyes narrowed as she approached the corner booth again. She could feel his suspicion, the way predators sense when prey behaves unexpectedly. "Can I get you anything else?" Her voice came out perfectly level, years of swallowing fear disguised as customer service. The man in the booth looked at her with something between gratitude and wonder, as if he couldn't believe she was still standing in the blast radius. "No, thank you." His voice was low, controlled, each word carefully measured. "I'm waiting for someone." The lie hung in the air between them, a fiction they both understood. He was waiting for rescue that wasn't coming. The front door opened and she felt her heart leap before crashing back down. It wasn't police or backup. Instead, 2 men in security uniforms entered, their faces familiar from the private dining room detail. They worked for the restaurant's owner, providing protection for VIP events. They took in the scene with professional assessment, their hands moving to weapons worn openly on their belts. The 5 men tensed, their formation breaking as they recalculated odds. The scar-faced man's hand moved toward his jacket but stopped when both security guards focused on him. "Gentlemen, the restaurant is closed for the evening." The lead security guard's voice carried authority that came from military training. "You'll need to settle your business elsewhere." His partner had already moved to flank them, cutting off the exit to the private dining area. The mathematics of the situation shifted in those seconds. 5 men with a bomb versus 2 armed guards in a public space. The scar-faced man's jaw worked as he weighed options, his hand still hovering near his jacket. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. The 5 men moved toward the exit with coordinated precision, their formation reforming around the scar-faced leader. They didn't hurry, but they didn't linger. Professionals who knew when a job had failed. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet dining room. The security guards remained alert, one moving to the window to watch the street. "Don't move yet," the lead guard said quietly, his eyes still on the door. "Give it 5 minutes. They might be watching to see if you panic." The man in the corner booth nodded fractionally, his body still locked in place. Claire stood frozen by table 8, the reality of what almost happened crashing over her like cold water. Her knees wanted to buckle, but she forced herself to remain upright. Minutes crawled past, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths. The security guard at the window finally stepped back, speaking quietly into his radio. "Clear. Vehicle departed south on East Bay." Only then did the tension in the room begin to fracture. "There's a bomb squad on the way," the lead guard said, moving closer but maintaining distance. "They'll need to clear the device before you can move. Miss, you should evacuate now." His eyes found Claire with professional concern, already dismissing her as civilian collateral. She didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she looked at the man in the corner booth, really looked at him for the first time. His face had gone pale beneath expensive grooming, a fine tremor running through his shoulders now that adrenaline had nowhere to go. "How did you know?" His question cut through the silence, directed at her with intensity that made her step back. "How did you know what they'd done?" The security guards turned to look at her with new interest, pieces clicking into place. She could lie, should lie, make up some story about seeing suspicious behavior. Instead, she told the truth because he'd trusted her whisper in a moment when trust meant life or death. "I recognized the setup. My ex-boyfriend worked for people who use pressure triggers." The admission hung in the air like smoke, revealing more than she'd intended. The security guards exchanged glances, their assessment of her shifting from innocent bystander to something more complicated. The man in the booth studied her with dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything. "What's your name?" His voice had softened but lost none of its intensity. She realized he'd sat in her section for 3 hours without ever asking, accepting her service as if she were part of the furniture. Now she was visible in a way that made her skin prickle. "Claire." The lie came automatically. The name on her tag that wasn't actually hers. She'd been using it for 18 months. A borrowed identity from a friend who'd left Charleston without looking back. Her real name was buried under 3 states and a lifetime of running. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw the exact second he recognized the lie. His lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile, acknowledgement passing between them. "Thank you, Claire." The way he said it made the false name sound like a shared secret. Sirens approached in the distance, multiple vehicles converging on the restaurant. The security guard moved to unlock the front door, preparing for the arrival of bomb techs and police. Soon the room would flood with questions and protocols, official channels that would grind through the night. "You should go," the man in the booth said quietly, his eyes still locked on hers, "before they start taking statements, before your name goes in a report." He understood what she hadn't said, reading between lines that most people never noticed existed. She hesitated, torn between survival instinct and something she couldn't name. He'd sat perfectly still on her word alone, trusted a stranger's whisper over his own eyes. That kind of faith deserved something more than her disappearing into the night like smoke. "The man with the scar," she said quickly, words tumbling out before courage failed. He checked his watch 3 times. "They're working on a timeline, probably coordinated with something else. This wasn't just about you. Information from observation, the only currency she had to offer." His expression sharpened, intelligence processing her words with visible speed. He nodded once, filing away what she'd given him. The sirens were close now, blue lights beginning to strobe through the front windows. She'd run out of time for decisions. Claire moved toward the kitchen, abandoning her section and her tips in the black apron that had been her uniform. The back exit opened to an alley that smelled like garbage and old rain, familiar territory for someone used to leaving through rear doors. Behind her, she heard voices flooding into the dining room, authority taking control. She didn't look back. Claire's apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up, in a building that had seen better decades, the kind of place where neighbors minded their business and landlords cashed checks without asking questions. She climbed the stairs with legs that still trembled, her keys gripped so tight they left marks in her palm. Inside, she didn't turn on the lights. The street lamp outside her window provided enough illumination to navigate the studio's sparse furniture. She dropped her purse on the second-hand table and moved to the window, looking down at the empty street below. Her hands shook as she untied the apron she'd somehow carried home, the black fabric still smelling like wine and fear. The name tag caught the orange glow from outside. Claire, stamped in white letters that belonged to someone else's life. She unpinned it with fumbling fingers and dropped it in the kitchen drawer. The man's face kept appearing behind her closed eyelids, that moment of understanding when he'd realized what she was telling him. She'd saved someone tonight, pulled a stranger back from the edge of a grave he hadn't known was open. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead left her hollow. Her phone buzzed from inside her purse, the vibration loud in the silent apartment. She ignored it, knowing it would be the manager demanding explanations for her disappearance. The Meridian's employee handbook probably had protocols for abandoning your shift during a bomb threat, but she wouldn't be there to read them. She'd need a new job by the end of the week, new references that couldn't be checked too carefully. The thought exhausted her more than the terror had, this endless cycle of running that never quite qualified as starting over. Charleston was supposed to have been different, far enough from Atlanta to matter. Her ex-boyfriend's face replaced the strangers in her mind, Tyler with his easy smile and dangerous friends, She'd loved him once before learning that love and survival rarely occupied the same space. The night she'd left, he'd been explaining pressure triggers to his crew while she'd pretended to sleep in the next room. That overheard conversation had saved a man's life 18 months later in a city Tyler had never visited. The irony tasted bitter, like coffee grounds and regret. She'd spent a year trying to forget everything about that life, but memory had turned out to be currency when it mattered most. Claire moved to her bed and sat on the edge, still wearing her work clothes. Sleep felt impossible, but staying awake felt worse, suspended between identities that no longer fit. The girl who'd loved Tyler was dead. Claire, the waitress, would be dead by morning when she failed to show up for her shift. Who she'd be tomorrow remained an open question with no good answers. She lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling, counting cracks instead of sheep. The phone buzzed again, then twice more in quick succession, before falling silent. Morning came too early, gray light filtering through curtains that didn't quite close. Claire rolled over and reached for her phone with dread settling in her stomach. 7 missed calls from the manager, 3 texts demanding she contact him immediately. But there was another number too, one she didn't recognize. The voicemail icon blinked at her. She pressed play with her heart in her throat, expecting police or worse. Instead, a woman's voice filled the small room, professional and brisk. "Miss Claire Morrison, this is Sarah Chen from the Charleston Police Department. We need you to come in and provide a statement regarding last night's incident at the Meridian. Please call this number at your earliest convenience." Morrison wasn't her real name either, just another borrowed identity from a friend of a friend. But hearing it spoken by law enforcement made her chest tight. She'd given that name on her application at the Meridian, backed it up with a social security number that wasn't quite fraud but wasn't quite legal either. Going to the police station meant questions she couldn't answer honestly. Not going meant looking guilty of something they'd eventually decide to investigate. She sat up and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to think through exhaustion and fear. Neither option led anywhere good. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from the unknown number. Just an address in the historic district and a time, 2 p.m. No name, no explanation. She stared at the message, trying to decode its meaning, whether it was threat or invitation or something she hadn't considered. Another text followed seconds later. "You saved my life. I'd like to return the favor. Come alone." She didn't need a signature to know who'd sent it. The stranger from the corner booth had somehow gotten her number, tracked down the identity she'd been hiding behind. The realization should have terrified her, but instead brought unexpected relief. Someone had seen her, really seen her, through all the careful invisibility. He understood what it meant that she'd told him to run before the police arrived, recognized the desperation of someone who couldn't afford official attention. That kind of seeing was dangerous, but it was also the first honest thing that had happened to her in 18 months. The address led to a law office in a building older than the Constitution, brick and wrought iron declaring old money with quiet certainty. Claire stood across the street at 1:55 p.m., watching people in expensive suits flow in and out of the polished doors. She'd changed 3 times before leaving her apartment, finally settling on jeans and a sweater that didn't look like she was trying too hard. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup except what was necessary to hide the sleepless night. She looked like exactly what she was, someone trying to disappear while walking into a spotlight. The door opened to marble floors and wood paneling that probably cost more than her annual salary. A receptionist looked up with professional courtesy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" The question carried weight, an assessment of whether Claire belonged in spaces like this. "I have an appointment at 2. She didn't offer a name, didn't know if she was expected, or if this was elaborate revenge disguised as gratitude. The receptionist checked her computer screen and nodded once, surprise flickering across her features before training smoothed it away. "3rd floor, suite 304. The elevator is to your left." She gestured with manicured fingers, already returning to her screen. Claire had been categorized and dismissed, recognized as temporary rather than belonging. The observation stung less than it should have. The elevator was the old kind with brass fixtures and a gate that closed manually. She pulled it shut and pressed the button for 3, watching floors slide past through the metal lattice. Her reflection in the polished brass looked like a stranger, pale and uncertain in a box designed to lift people far above her station. Suite 304 had frosted glass doors with gold lettering, Castellano and Associates, private consultants. She didn't know what that meant, what kind of consulting required offices in historic buildings. Her hand hesitated on the door handle, last chance to turn around and disappear into the anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. She pushed through into a waiting room that was all leather chairs and abstract art. No receptionist here, just expensive silence and the smell of furniture polish. A door opened on the far wall, and he stepped through. The stranger from the corner booth, looking somehow both familiar and impossible. He'd traded the charcoal suit for black slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. The casual elegance made him seem younger, closer to human instead of the untouchable figure who'd sat surrounded by documents and danger. His dark eyes found hers with immediate recognition. "You came." He said it like he'd expected her to run, like her appearance here qualified as bravery rather than desperation. "I wasn't sure you would." He gestured toward the open door behind him, an invitation into private space that felt loaded with consequence. Claire crossed the waiting room on legs that remembered how to fake confidence. The office beyond was smaller than she expected, lined with bookshelves and a window overlooking the street. A desk sat centered in the room, its surface clear, except for a closed laptop and a phone turned face down. "Please, sit." He indicated a chair positioned to face the desk but not behind it, careful positioning that acknowledged her wariness. She sat on the edge of the leather, ready to bolt if the conversation turned wrong. He remained standing, leaning against the bookshelf with studied casualness. "The police want to talk to me." She said it before he could start, establishing ground rules. "I can't go. I can't give statements or have my name in reports." The admission hung between them, confirming what he'd already guessed. She watched his face for judgment and found only careful consideration. "I know." His voice was quiet, matter of fact. "I had my people look into Claire Morrison. She doesn't exist beyond 18 months ago, which means someone's running from something." He didn't make it sound like accusation, just observation of facts he'd already accepted. "What's your real name?" She almost lied again, the instinct so ingrained it was practically involuntary, but he'd sat still on her word while death waited beneath him, trusted her with his life based on nothing but a whisper. That kind of faith deserved truth, even if it cost her. "Emma Reeves." He nodded slowly, testing the name against her face as if checking for fit. "Emma." The way he said it was different from how he'd said Claire. No irony or shared deception, just her name spoken carefully, like something fragile. "I'm Dante Castellano, and you're right, you can't talk to the police. The device under my chair was sophisticated, military grade according to the bomb squad. They'll investigate everyone who was in the building, looking for connections to the people who planted it." He pushed off from the bookshelf and moved to the window, looking down at the street with his back to her. "Your face will end up in databases. People who want to find you will have current photos, current location." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her chair, reality catching up to the decision she'd made in the moment. She'd saved his life, and in doing so had painted a target on her own back. Tyler's crew would see her face in investigation reports, recognize her despite the fake name and dyed hair. Running had just become exponentially harder. "I can make you disappear properly." Dante turned back from the window, his expression serious. "Not the half measure you've been managing with borrowed names and cash-only apartments. Real documentation, background that survives scrutiny, a life that doesn't require looking over your shoulder." He paused, letting the offer settle. "But it comes with conditions." Emma felt her throat tighten, the phantom taste of too good to be true coating her tongue. Nothing came free in the world she'd escaped, especially not from men who wore expensive suits and had bombs planted under their chairs. "What kind of conditions?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You work for me." Dante moved back to the desk but didn't sit behind it, instead perching on its edge to maintain eye level with her. "I own several businesses in Charleston, all of them legitimate. I need people who can think quickly under pressure, who notice details others miss. You proved you're capable of both." It sounded reasonable, almost boring in its normalcy, which meant it wasn't the whole truth, just the part he thought she could handle hearing. Emma had learned to read men who dealt in partial truths, spending enough time with Tyler's crew to recognize when the real job existed in the spaces between words. "What do you really do?" She asked it directly, tired of dancing around obvious lies. "People don't plant military-grade bombs under legitimate businessmen, and private consultants don't have the resources to create identities that fool federal databases." She watched his face, cataloging the slight tightening around his eyes that meant she'd hit close to truth. Dante studied her for a long moment, some internal calculation playing out behind dark eyes. "My family has interests that occasionally attract unwanted attention from competitors. I manage those interests and protect the people involved." The corporate language was deliberate, sanitized. Everything we do operates within legal boundaries, but we exist in spaces where law and necessity sometimes have complicated relationships. Translation: organized crime dressed in legitimate business suits, the kind of operation that survived by keeping visible activities clean while hiding everything that mattered. Emma should have been horrified, should have stood up and walked out of the expensive office into the uncertain safety of her borrowed life. Instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her. She'd grown up around men who broke rules, loved one who'd crossed lines she'd pretended not to see. This was familiar territory. Dangerous, but at least, honestly, dangerous. Better than waitressing for people who looked through her while she counted tips and prayed her past stayed buried in another state. What would I actually be doing? Initially, administrative work at one of my restaurants. He gestured vaguely, encompassing legitimate business. You'd be visible, established, building a paper trail that makes Emma Reeves real. But I'd also need you to do what you did last night. Watch, listen, notice things that seem wrong. You have instincts that most people never develop. Emma processed the offer, turning it over like a coin with unknown value on both sides. He was recruiting her into whatever shadow organization had earned someone's lethal attention, but he was also offering the first real safety she'd known since leaving Atlanta, protection that came from power rather than hiding. And if I say no, then I give you $20,000 cash and a phone number for someone who can create decent identification. Dante's expression didn't change, no pressure or manipulation creeping into his tone. You'd have a head start before the police investigation makes running harder. No obligations, no strings. You saved my life, Emma. I don't repay that kind of debt by forcing you into corners. The lack of coercion was almost harder to process than threats would have been. She'd expected ultimatums, the kind of trap disguised as choice that powerful men specialized in. Instead, he was offering genuine options, trusting her to make the decision that served her survival. It was disorienting, being treated like an equal by someone who clearly operated in different stratospheres of power. Why me? The question came out smaller than she intended. You probably have dozens of people who could do this work. People with training and backgrounds that aren't disasters. Why offer this to a waitress with a fake name and a criminal ex-boyfriend? Dante's expression softened almost imperceptibly, something that might have been respect crossing his features. Because when death walked through the door last night, you didn't run. You walked toward it carrying an expensive wine bottle and a warning. That kind of courage is rare, Emma. I don't waste rare things. She thought about her apartment with its water-stained ceiling, the endless cycle of new cities and borrowed names. She thought about Tyler, and the year she'd spent loving someone who'd treated her like property. She thought about the bomb squad pulling apart a chair, because she'd whispered 6 words to a stranger in the dark. If I do this, I need to know what happened to the men who came last night. Her voice had found strength again, anchored by the decision forming in her chest. I need to know what I'm walking into. Who wants you dead enough to plant bombs in public places? No sanitized corporate language, just truth. Dante nodded slowly, acknowledgement of her right to information that affected her survival. They work for the Marchetti family, rivals who want control of shipping interests my family manages through the port. The bombing was meant to look like an accident, eliminate me without starting a war. He paused, weighing his next words. They failed, which means they'll try again. Being near me comes with risks that don't disappear just because you're staff. Emma absorbed this, the reality of violence that wouldn't stop just because she disrupted one attempt. But violence had been chasing her anyway, different faces attached to the same fundamental danger. At least here, the threat came with resources to fight back instead of just running faster. When would I start? Tomorrow, if you want the job. Dante straightened from the desk, extending his hand toward her. I'll have documentation ready within 48 hours. Until then, you'll stay in a corporate apartment building I own downtown, somewhere secure while we handle the police investigation. His hand hung in the air between them, an offer and a bridge into unknown territory. Emma stood and took his hand, feeling calluses that surprised her on someone who wore suits like armor. His grip was firm, but not crushing, the handshake of someone who didn't need to prove strength through pressure. I want it, she said, and felt the words settle into truth as she spoke them. I want the job. Something flickered in his eyes, relief maybe, or satisfaction at a problem solved. Then welcome to Castellano and Associates, Miss Reeves. He released her hand but didn't step back, maintaining the close proximity that made the moment feel weighted. I'll have my driver take you to collect your things from your apartment. You won't be going back there. The finality of it should have scared her. this severing of the life she'd built from borrowed pieces. Instead, Emma felt light, untethered in a way that promised either flight or falling. She'd jumped off enough cliffs to know the difference wouldn't be clear until she landed. What do I tell my landlord? Nothing. I'll have someone handle the lease termination and forward any mail. Dante moved toward the door, transitioning from the intimate space they'd created back into business efficiency. The police will look for Claire Morrison at that address and find she moved without notice. Dead ends are useful when you need them to be. The corporate apartment occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, all clean lines and furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines. Emma stood in the center of the living room while Dante's driver deposited her 2 duffel bags by the door. Everything she owned fitting into spaces meant for weekend trips. There's food in the kitchen, basics to get you through a few days. Dante gestured toward the open-plan space, stainless steel appliances gleaming under recessed lighting. The building has 24-hour security. Your name is on the approved list, but no one else gets up without calling first. Emma nodded, still processing the transition from her 4th-floor walk-up to this vertical fortress. The windows offered views of Charleston's historic district, church spires and palm trees spreading below like a postcard. She'd spent 18 months looking at brick walls and fire escapes, geography that reminded her to stay small. There's a phone on the counter, programmed with my direct number. He moved toward the door, giving her space to breathe. Use it if you need anything or if something feels wrong. Trust your instincts, Emma. They've kept you alive this long. She watched him prepare to leave. This stranger who'd upended her careful invisibility in less than 24 hours. Dante? His name felt strange on her tongue. Too familiar and not familiar enough. Why are you really doing this? The debt doesn't require penthouses and new identities. He paused in the doorway, considering her question with visible care. Because I've spent 10 years building walls between myself and everyone else. Last night, you walked through all of them without hesitation. His expression shifted into something almost vulnerable. That kind of fearlessness deserves protection, not exploitation. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Emma alone in borrowed luxury. She moved to the window and looked down at the street 15 floors below, watching cars and people move in patterns that didn't include her. For the first time in years, she felt the dangerous stirring of hope taking root in her chest. 3 days passed in strange suspension, Emma existing in the apartment like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Dante called twice daily, brief check-ins that felt more personal than professional. She learned he took his coffee black and hated mornings, small details that accumulated into a portrait of unexpected humanity. The documentation arrived on the 4th day, delivered by a woman in a courier uniform, who handed over a manila envelope without comment. Inside, Emma found a driver's license, social security card, and birth certificate, all bearing her real name backed by fabricated history that looked seamless. Emma Reeves had been born in Savannah, attended community college in Columbia, worked retail jobs that left paper trails through tax records. The life he'd built for her was ordinary enough to be invisible, remarkable only in how thoroughly unremarkable it appeared. She studied the documents with reluctant admiration for whoever had crafted such perfect fiction. Her first day of work arrived with sunrise painting the harbor pink and gold outside her windows. She dressed in clothes that had been delivered the previous evening, business casual that fit perfectly despite no measurements being taken. The attention to detail felt both comforting and slightly invasive, evidence of resources she couldn't begin to measure. The restaurant was called Harborside, positioned on the waterfront with views of boats and bridges. Emma arrived at 9 to find Dante waiting in the manager's office, looking exhausted in a way that suggested he hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his suit remained impeccable, armor against whatever had kept him awake. The Marchetti family knows about you. He said it without preamble, delivering bad news like ripping off bandages. They have photos from the Meridian's security footage, your face clear enough for identification. I wanted you to know before you decided whether to stay. Emma felt ice water replace blood in her veins, but her expression remained steady, years of hiding fear presenting as calm. How much danger am I in? She needed facts, not comfort. Accurate assessment of threats she'd inherited by whispering warnings to strangers. Do they know who I am? They know you warned me, which makes you either competition or a problem that needs solving. Dante's honesty felt brutal and necessary, respect disguised as harsh reality. We've increased security protocols across all properties. You'll have a driver who's trained in protection, and this building has been cleared of potential vulnerabilities. She should walk away. take the $20,000 he'd offered, and disappear into another borrowed identity. But Emma was tired of running, exhausted by the endless cycle of new names and temporary addresses. Sometimes survival meant standing ground instead of seeking new territory to abandon when danger inevitably followed. "I'm staying." Dante's relief was visible, tension leaving his shoulders in incremental release. "Then we do this carefully. You work front of house here initially, visible and legitimate. The Marchettis watch my businesses, so we use that. Let them see you're just staff." His strategy unfolded like chess moves, positioning pieces for games she barely understood. The work was surprisingly normal. Emma training under a manager who treated her like any new hire, learning table numbers and kitchen timing. She memorized wine lists and plate presentations, her body remembering the rhythm of restaurant service. But now she also cataloged faces, noting who lingered too long or asked questions that felt wrong. Dante appeared during lunch service on her third day, sitting at a table near the kitchen, where he could watch the dining room without being obvious. Emma felt his presence like static electricity, awareness that prickled along her spine whenever they occupied the same space. She brought him water without being asked, a gesture that felt both professional and intimate. "Table 7 has been nursing the same drink for 40 minutes. She said it quietly while refilling his glass, information delivered under the guise of service. "He's watching the private dining area more than his phone." The observation came naturally. Instincts she'd developed for survival now employed for purposes she was still learning to understand. Dante's eyes flicked toward table 7, cataloging the man with professional assessment. "Good catch. That's surveillance, probably Marchetti." He said it calmly, like discussing weather instead of enemies watching from inside his own restaurant. "Let him watch. We have nothing to hide today." But something in his tone suggested other days might be different. That legitimate business was only part of the operation. Emma felt the weight of secrets she hadn't been told, information deliberately withheld until she proved trustworthy enough to handle truth. The distance felt appropriate and frustrating in equal measure, protection that also qualified as exclusion. Weeks accumulated into a strange new normal, Emma settling into routines that included morning check-ins with Dante and evening reviews of anything unusual she'd observed. They developed shorthand, communication that required fewer words, as understanding deepened. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, the way exhaustion manifested as unusual stillness rather than visible fatigue. He learned she took her coffee with excessive sugar and hated being startled, small preferences she'd never shared with anyone who bothered remembering. The attention felt foreign, being known by someone who didn't require her to perform constant gratitude for basic consideration. It shifted something fundamental in how she moved through space, permission to exist, rather than just survive. The black SUV appeared on a Tuesday morning, parked across from her building with tinted windows that reflected dawn light. Emma noticed it from her 15th floor window while drinking her too-sweet coffee, the vehicle's presence wrong in a way that triggered every alarm her instincts possessed. She called Dante before her conscious mind finished identifying the threat. "There's a car watching the building." Her voice stayed level, despite her pulse hammering in her throat. Black SUV, no plates visible from this angle. Been there since at least 6. She heard him moving on the other end of the line, the rustle of clothing suggesting she'd woken him despite the early hour. "Stay inside, away from windows." Dante's voice had shed all warmth, pure command sharpened by concern. "I'm sending a team to sweep the vehicle. Don't leave the apartment until I call you back." The line went dead before she could respond, efficiency replacing the careful consideration he usually employed with her. Emma moved away from the window, but positioned herself where she could still observe the street through reflected angles. 20 minutes crawled past before 2 men in maintenance uniforms approached the SUV, their movements too coordinated to be random building staff. They circled the vehicle twice before one produced tools that had nothing to do with legitimate repair work. Her phone rang and she answered before the first buzz completed. "It's clean. No explosives." Dante sounded simultaneously relieved and frustrated. "Just surveillance, but the message is clear. They want you to know they can reach you whenever they decide to." The threat hung between them, promise of violence wrapped in restraint that could evaporate without warning. "I need to disappear again." Emma said it even though the words tasted like defeat. She'd lasted 6 weeks in her new identity, long enough to believe stability might actually be possible. "They'll keep escalating until someone gets hurt, and I won't be responsible for collateral damage to your operation." "No." The word came swift and absolute. "You disappearing is what they want. Proof that intimidation works. We don't give them that satisfaction." Dante's conviction resonated through the phone, certainty that should have felt presumptuous. but instead registered as protection. Pack a bag. You're moving somewhere they can't watch so easily. The somewhere turned out to be his house, a historic property in the Battery where old money whispered through centuries-old walls. Emma stood in the foyer, feeling displaced, her duffel bag insignificant against backdrop of inherited wealth. This is too much. I can stay in a hotel somewhere less personal. Hotels have registries that can be accessed. Dante took her bag like the discussion was already settled. This house has security that predates modern surveillance, walls thick enough that technology becomes irrelevant. You'll be safe here while we figure out the Marchetti problem permanently. He gestured toward stairs that curved upward with architectural grace. The guest room was larger than her entire previous apartment, decorated in blues and grays that felt masculine without being aggressive. Emma set her bag on the bed and moved to windows that overlooked a garden where camellias bloomed despite approaching winter. How long has it been since someone else stayed here? The question emerged before she could consider its implications. Years. Dante appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with studied casualness. I don't invite people into personal spaces often. Habit from growing up where privacy was the only luxury my family couldn't buy. The admission felt significant, glimpse behind carefully maintained walls. The resolution came not through violence but through leverage Emma herself provided. 3 days after moving into Dante's house, she remembered something Tyler had mentioned during one of his late-night bragging sessions about the Marchetti operation. They laundered money through a shipping company in Savannah, using falsified manifests that her ex-boyfriend had helped create. She told Dante over breakfast, the information spilling out between bites of toast she couldn't taste. He listened with absolute focus, his coffee growing cold as she detailed everything she could recall. Within hours, his people had confirmed the operation, gathered evidence that could bring federal attention the Marchetti family couldn't afford. The negotiation happened in a neutral location, a lawyer's office where both families sat across polished tables with decades of animosity temporarily set aside. Dante presented the evidence without theatrics, simple facts that carried weight of potential destruction. The Marchetti representative, an older man with careful eyes, studied the documents with visible resignation. You're offering a trade. It wasn't a question, just acknowledgement of terms both sides understood. Our withdrawal from Charleston interests in exchange for your silence on Savannah. The calculation played across his weathered features, measuring losses against catastrophic exposure. And the girl? Is under my protection permanently. Dante's voice carried finality that left no room for negotiation. Any action against her is action against my family directly. The documentation I have goes to federal authorities within hours of any incident. He leaned back, having played the only cards that mattered. We both walk away from this. That's the offer. The Marchetti representative nodded slowly, age and experience recognizing when games had reached their conclusion. Papers were signed with witnesses present, agreements that carried weight of mutual assured destruction. The war ended not with explosions, but with signatures. Violence diffused by information Emma had carried without knowing its value. They drove home in silence that felt different from the tense quiet of recent weeks. Dante's hands relaxed on the wheel. Emma watched Charleston slide past her window, the city transformed from hostile territory into something that might actually become home. It's really over? She needed confirmation. Permission to believe safety might last longer than borrowed moments. It's over. Dante pulled through his gate, the house appearing between live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The Marchettis honor their agreements when the alternative is worse. You're safe now, Emma. Actually safe, not just hiding better. He parked and turned to face her, something vulnerable in his expression, which means you don't have to stay here anymore if you don't want to. The offer hung between them, freedom disguised as courtesy. Emma could take her new identity and build a life separate from his dangerous world, start over with resources that actually worked. She'd earned that option through courage and information, paid for independence with risks she'd never asked to take. The guest room upstairs could return to years of emptiness while she found her own space. What if I want to stay? The question came out softer than intended, admission of feelings that had grown in quiet moments between crisis and coffee. Not because I need protection or owe you debts, but because coming home to this house with you in it feels different than any place I've ever lived. Dante's expression shifted into something that looked like relief wrapped in wonder, as if he'd hoped, but not dared to expect. Then stay, not as an employee or someone I'm protecting. He reached across and took her hand with familiar care. Stay as someone who belongs here with me, building something neither of us planned, but both of us want. Emma squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, evidence of parallel struggles that had somehow intersected in a restaurant where death had waited beneath expensive wine and whispered warnings. "I'll stay." The words felt like victory, like the first honest choice she'd made that didn't involve running. "But I'm keeping the job at Harborside. I like the work, and I'm good at noticing things. I'm counting on it." He smiled, the expression transforming his face into something younger, less burdened by inherited weight. They sat in the car while Charleston evening settled around them, two people who'd saved each other in different ways, finally safe enough to stop counting exits. The house waited with lights burning in windows, no longer empty but filled with possibility neither had dared imagine 6 weeks ago. 6 months later, Emma stood in Harborside's kitchen during the dinner rush, expediting orders with efficiency that made the chef nod approval. She wore her real name on her name tag now, Emma Reeves printed in letters that belonged to her completely. The restaurant hummed with successful service, every table filled with patrons who had no idea the woman coordinating their meals had once saved the owner's life with 6 whispered words. Dante appeared during dessert service, taking his usual table near the kitchen where he could watch her work. She brought him coffee without asking, the gesture now habit built from countless repetitions. "Quiet night," she said, setting down the cup. "Nothing unusual to report, except Table 12 asked if we cater weddings." "Do we?" He looked up at her with amusement playing around his mouth, the question carrying weight beyond catering services. They'd talked around the subject for weeks, dancing near commitment without naming it directly, but his eyes held something that looked like hope mixed with certainty, waiting for her to close the distance. "Maybe we should start." Emma felt her own smile forming, answer to questions they'd both been asking in silence. "I hear there's demand for it." She touched his shoulder briefly before returning to the kitchen, the gesture small, but deliberate. Behind her, she heard him laugh quietly, the sound carrying through dinner noise like a promise kept. They'd both been running from different things before a bomb and a warning brought them to the same moment. Now they were building something that didn't require either of them to disappear, a life constructed from honest names and shared mornings, and the kind of safety that came from being truly known. The debt had been repaid in full, replaced by something that felt remarkably like home. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments which part of the world you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories like Emma and Dante's. What did you think of their journey? Let me know below.